Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really significant source stack, one that gets into the Vietnam War. Our goal here is to unpack how containment, that core Cold War idea, led the U.S. into this massive military conflict. And crucially, how it ended up completely reshaping the power balance between the president and Congress. We're tracing it from ideology right down to legislation.
Yeah, and it's vital to get this from the start. Vietnam wasn't just a Cold War proxy fight. I mean, it was definitely that, but it was also this intense collision. You had U.S. anti-communism hitting head-on against these really powerful post-colonial nationalist movements that were sweeping across Asia. Remember, lots of new nations were trying to stay non-aligned, independent of both superpowers.
Okay, so let's set that stage. 1954. The French are out after the First Indochina War, right?
They lose at Dien Bien Phu, and the Geneva Accords happen.
And that's when Vietnam gets split.
Yeah.
At the 17th parallel. North is communist, Ho Chi Minh. South is anti-communist, and, well, soon becomes heavily backed by the U.S.
Exactly. And the U.S. focus, the fear really wasn't just about Ho Chi Minh himself. It was about what his success might mean for the whole neighborhood.
Which leads us straight into the core justification, the domino theory. President Eisenhower really pushed this.
Yeah, the sources make that crystal clear. It wasn't just talk. It was the bedrock ideology. The idea being, if South Vietnam falls,
then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, maybe even further, like dominoes tipping over, it felt almost inevitable to them, an existential threat.
And you have to factor in the timing, right? Mao's victory in China was 1949. That wasn't ancient history. It was fresh, and it terrified Washington.
Absolutely terrified them. The thought of China, this huge communist power, exporting revolution across Asia, that made holding the line in South Vietnam seem strategically non-negotiable.
But looking back, and our sources point this out, applying that sort of monolithic Cold War, Europe-centric model, it seems like it missed the point in Southeast Asia. It really did. It saw Ho Chi Minh almost purely as, a puppet of Moscow or Beijing. It largely ignored his deep roots as a Vietnamese nationalist fighting for independence, first from the French, now effectively from foreign influence again.
So the U.S. misread the local dynamics. They saw communism, not nationalism.
Pretty much. And these newly independent countries, they had weak governments, unstable economies. They were vulnerable, sure, but not necessarily because they wanted communism. They were susceptible to any powerful influence offering aid or stability. So U.S. intervention was driven by this strategic fear, but it was a fear based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what was actually happening on the ground.
And that fear, that misunderstanding, it paved the way for military involvement. It started small, didn't it, under Kennedy?
Yeah, 1961 to 63. Relatively small beginnings. Officially, about 16,000 U.S. military advisors sent to help South Vietnam.
But that term advisors,
Yeah.
We need to dig into that. The sources suggest it was, well, misleading.
Oh, incredibly misleading. Yes, they were training the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, but they were also involved in combat operations, running intelligence, planning missions. It was, let's call it mission creep from day one.
Okay, so the involvement's already deeper than the label suggests. Then comes the big flashpoint, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, August 64.
Right, the official story. North Vietnamese torpedo boats launch unprovoked attacks on U.S. destroyers, the Maddox and Turner Joy, in international waters.
And this is where the whole constitutional picture changes dramatically, isn't it? Because that incident, which, later accounts suggest was murky.
Very murky. Questions about whether the second attack even happened, whether the administration exaggerated the certainty, it's all debated. But Johnson used it immediately.
So why did Congress go along with it so readily if the initial reports might have been shaky?
Well, you have that underlying fear of communism we talked about, plus, honestly, a very swift political move by Johnson. He pushed for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
And that resolution was everything.
Absolutely everything. It was effectively Congress handing the president a blank check. It gave Johnson and later Nixon the authority to use military force to escalate massively without needing a formal declaration of war from Congress.
A huge shift in power, bypassing the traditional checks and balances.
Completely. And that authorization enabled the strategy of gradual escalation. The thinking in the military, in the White House, was basically, if we just keep adding pressure, keep adding troops, keep adding firepower, eventually North Vietnam will crack. They'll give up.
But they didn't.
Not even close. The numbers are stark. You look at 63, maybe 40,000 North Vietnamese troops operating in the South. Fast forward just 4 years, 1967. Over 400,000 American troops are there actively fighting.
Wow. 10 times the enemy presence, but still no win. Why was that strategy failing so badly?
Because the battlefield didn't fit the strategy. U.S. forces were trained for conventional warfare, big units, taking territory, clear front lines, but that's not what they faced.
They faced guerrilla warfare.
Exactly, asymmetric warfare. The North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, and especially the Viet Cong, the VC, in the South, they didn't stand and fight big battles they knew they'd lose. They used hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, incredibly sophisticated tunnel networks to hide and move, booby traps. It was designed to inflict casualties, drain morale, and avoid America's overwhelming firepower.
Which meant for U.S. soldiers, immense frustration. High casualties, often without ever seeing the enemy clearly, minimal territory actually held.
And the psychological toll, the sources, like the accounts from soldiers, Jacob Fernandez, for example, they describe this constant stress, the jungle climate, the invisible enemy, the difficulty telling friend from foe in villages, the brutal urban fighting later on. It was hellish.
It's important to remember that human cost. And you mentioned future leaders like Colin Powell learning from this.
Yeah, that generation of officers, Powell included, they got a crash course in counterinsurgency and fighting these non-state actors, these asymmetric threats. It profoundly shaped U.S. military thinking for decades to come, even up to Iraq and Afghanistan.
So struggles on the ground, strategy not working, and then things start to unravel back home. The credibility gap.
Ah, yes. This was huge. Vietnam was the first war beamed directly into American living rooms every night on the news. The televised war.
And people were seeing things that didn't match the official story.
Precisely. For the first time, Americans were seeing graphic images of combat, dead and wounded soldiers, civilians suffering, villages burning. It was raw. It was immediate.
And the government, the military briefings back in Washington or Saigon, they kept saying, we're making progress, there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Right. But the pictures told a different story. A much more brutal, chaotic, and often stalemated story. That disconnect, that gap between the official optimism and the televised reality, that's the credibility gap. Trust in the government plummeted.
And that fuels the anti-war movement.
Massively. It starts on college campuses, but it spreads. Civil rights leaders join in, questioning the morality, the resources being poured into Vietnam instead of problems at home. Ordinary people start marching. You get huge protests, sit-ins. It becomes a major force in American life.
That simmering tension, that credibility gap, it just explodes with the Tet Offensive, doesn't it? Early 1968.
Tet is the turning point, absolutely. It was this massive, coordinated surprise attack by the NVA and VC all across South Vietnam simultaneously. They hit major cities, provincial capitals, military bases. They even breached the walls of the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon for a few hours. A huge shock.
Now, militarily, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually beat back the attacks,
Yeah.
right? Inflicted heavy losses.
They did. Militarily, Tet was arguably a failure for the North. They lost a lot of fighters, especially the VC cadres in the South. But politically and psychologically, it was devastating for the U.S. war effort.
How so?
Because the sheer scale and audacity of the offensive, broadcast all over American TV, completely shattered the official narrative that the enemy was weak and the war was nearly won. If the enemy could launch this, how could we possibly be winning?
Walter Cronkite, the CBS News anchor, famously editorialized that the war seemed unwinnable after Tet.
Exactly. And when Cronkite said it, middle America listened. Public support for the war just collapsed. President Johnson saw the writing on the wall. He announced he wouldn't seek re-election. He halted the bombing of North Vietnam. And he essentially abandoned plans for further major troop increases. Tet broke the political will to escalate further.
So the public mood shifts dramatically.
Oh.
Then, a few years later, comes another bombshell, the Pentagon Papers,
Yeah.
1971.
Right. Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst who'd worked on this internal study, leaks it to the New York Times. And these documents, they were explosive. They laid bare decades, going back long before Johnson, of government decision-making about Vietnam. They showed internal pessimism, strategic failures, awareness that the war wasn't going well, all hidden from the public.
And crucially, they revealed the manipulation and questionable intelligence surrounding the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Yes, it confirmed the worst fears of the credibility gap. It wasn't just spin, it was documented deception over multiple administrations. It showed how unchecked executive power had led the country into this quagmire based on, well, sometimes false premises.
So the war effort is discredited, the government's trustworthiness is shot, Congress finally decides it has to step back in and reclaim some authority.
Exactly. The pendulum swings back. Congress realizes it essentially abdicated its constitutional war-making powers with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. They need to claw that power back.
And the result is the War Powers Act of 1973.
passed over President Nixon's veto, actually. It was a direct response to Vietnam, a direct attempt to prevent future presidents from unilaterally waging long-term wars.
What are the key parts? How does it try to limit the president?
Two main things, really. First, the president has to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action. Just tell them what's happening. But the real teeth are in the second part. Those forces can't remain for more than 60 days without specific congressional authorization, either a declaration of war or some other statutory approval. There's a possible 30-day extension for withdrawal, but that 60-day clock is the core check.
So no more open-ended commitments based on something like the Tonkin Gulf Resolution.
That was the intent, to force a president to come back to Congress and get approval if they wanted to sustain a military engagement, to restore that legislative check on executive power.
Okay, so Congress reasserts itself. Meanwhile, on the ground, U.S. involvement is winding down under Nixon. Vietnamization, they called it.
Right. The idea was to gradually pull U.S. troops out while building up the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, to carry the fight themselves. More training, more equipment for them, fewer American combat troops.
The Paris Peace Accords are signed in '73, officially ending direct U.S. involvement.
But the fighting between North and South Vietnam continued. And without that massive U.S. support, the South Vietnamese government and military couldn't hold.
Leading to the fall of Saigon in April 1975. A really devastating end.
A tragic end. And looking back, synthesizing this whole period, the legacy is just immense. Vietnam really showed the limits of American military power, especially in complex ideological conflicts against determined nationalist movements using asymmetric tactics. It proved, undeniably, the power of public opinion, especially when fueled by uncensored media coverage, to shape and constrain foreign policy. And maybe most importantly, it highlighted the dangerous long-term consequences of applying rigid Cold War thinking to incredibly complex local situations around the globe.
So we went from the domino theory, this abstract fear, through the Gulf of Tonkin deception, the brutal reality on the ground, the crisis of trust at home, all the way to the War Powers Act trying to rein in presidential power. A huge arc.
It really is. And it leaves us with a critical question, something for you, the listener, to really mull over. Given that crisis of trust and executive overreach during Vietnam, how effectively does the War Powers Act actually function today? We still live in a world demanding swift executive action, but the Constitution demands legislative oversight. How is that tension playing out now, and does that 1973 Act truly provide the check it was designed to be?
A really vital question, especially given ongoing debates about military interventions. Definitely something to keep thinking about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into containment, Vietnam, and its lasting impact. We'll see you next time.